Imagine remembering a childhood home, the smell of rain on the window, the creaking wooden stairs, the way sunlight fell across the hallway every afternoon. But one day, someone shows you proof that you never lived there. The photographs don't match. The address doesn't exist. The people you remember were never part of your life. Yet the memory feels real, vivid, emotional. And the most unsettling question begins to whisper in the back of your mind. If that memory isn't yours, then whose is it? Because history, both personal and collective, might not be as stable as we believe. For centuries, philosophers, scientists, and historians have struggled with a disturbing possibility. What if memories can be rewritten? What if they can be implanted? And what if some of the memories shaping our lives didn't originate inside our own minds at all? Tonight, we step into one of the strangest intersections of history, psychology, and human identity. A journey that begins with ancient philosophers and leads to modern laboratories where scientists are already experimenting with the architecture of memory itself. And by the end of this story, you may start wondering something you've never questioned before. How much of your past actually belongs to you? Before we dive deeper into this mystery, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel if you enjoy deep history and mind-bending stories like this. And in the comments, tell me where in the world you're watching from, or what job you do while listening to these stories. It's always fascinating to see the incredible range of people joining these journeys. Now, let's begin.
The first human who questioned memory may have done so in silence. Perhaps it happened at the end of a long life, when an old man sat beside a fire, recalling events from decades earlier, only to realize that some details no longer matched what others remembered. The battle he fought in seemed different in his mind than in the stories told by younger soldiers. The village where he grew up felt larger in his memory than it appeared when he returned. Even the faces of people he loved had slowly shifted, softened, or sharpened in ways he could not explain. And so, a question began echoing across generations long before science could answer it. Can memory truly be trusted? Thousands of years ago, this question fascinated some of the greatest thinkers in human history. Among them was the Greek philosopher Plato, who believed memory was not a simple storage of experiences, but something far more mysterious. In one of his most famous philosophical ideas, Plato proposed the theory of recollection. According to him, learning itself might actually be a form of remembering. Plato suggested that the human soul had existed before birth, already possessing knowledge of truth and reality. When we learn something new, we are not truly discovering it for the first time. Instead, we are recalling something our soul once knew. It was a poetic idea, but hidden within it was a deeper suspicion. Memory might not be a perfect record of reality. It might be something far stranger. Plato illustrated this uncertainty through another powerful metaphor, the allegory of the cave. In this story, prisoners live their entire lives inside a cave, watching shadows cast on a wall. They believe the shadows are reality because that is all they have ever seen. But the shadows are only distortions of objects passing in front of a fire behind them. In other words, what they remember is not truth. It is only a projection. And if memory can capture shadows instead of reality, then every recollection we hold might already be slightly distorted. Centuries later, Roman thinkers began noticing the same phenomenon, but from a different perspective. The historian Tacitus once warned that history itself could be reshaped by the fragile nature of human memory. When people recount events years later, their memories often bend toward pride, fear, or loyalty. Victories grow larger. Failures quietly disappear. Enemies become monsters, and allies become heroes. What begins as memory slowly transforms into legend. The Roman orator Cicero also explored the strange workings of memory. He described it as a mental palace, a vast structure where the mind stores images and experiences. But Cicero noticed something unsettling. The palace was not stable. Rooms could change, objects could move, and sometimes memories seemed to rearrange themselves over time. In ancient Rome, professional speakers even trained their memories using a technique known as the method of loci. They would imagine walking through a familiar building, placing pieces of information in different rooms so they could retrieve them later during speeches. It worked surprisingly well, but the technique revealed an uncomfortable truth. Memories were not stored like books in a library.
They were constructed using imagination, and imagination is never perfectly reliable. Across the world, other civilizations were wrestling with the same mystery. In ancient India, philosophers studying consciousness began exploring the idea that perception itself might distort reality. Early thinkers within the traditions that later influenced Buddhist philosophy suggested that the mind constantly reshapes experience. According to their teachings, memory was not a fixed recording of the past. Instead, it was a constantly evolving interpretation of events, shaped by emotions, desires, and beliefs. Every time a memory is recalled, it is slightly altered before being stored again. Over a lifetime, these tiny distortions accumulate like layers of dust on an old painting. Eventually, the image that remains may look very different from the original moment. Chinese historians also confronted this problem. During the time of the great historian Sima Qian, scholars attempted to record the true history of China in monumental works like the Records of the Grand Historian. But Sima Qian understood a difficult truth. History is built on human memory. Witnesses tell stories. Officials record reports. Generations repeat what they believe happened. Yet every retelling subtly changes the narrative. Over centuries, the original events can become nearly impossible to separate from the stories built around them. And sometimes, entire civilizations begin to remember the past in ways that never truly occurred. Even in ancient warfare, this distortion appeared. After battles, soldiers from the same army often gave completely different accounts of what happened. Some remembered heroic charges, others recalled chaos and confusion. Certain moments became crystal clear in one soldier's memory while disappearing entirely in another's. It was as if each person had lived through a slightly different version of the same event. The battlefield itself had not changed, but memory had reshaped it. By the time the Middle Ages arrived, scholars across Europe began recognizing the same strange pattern. Monks who carefully copied historical manuscripts sometimes noticed contradictions between different accounts of the same events. One chronicle described a king as wise and beloved. Another painted him as cruel and tyrannical. Both authors believed they were telling the truth. Both relied on memories passed down through generations. And yet the stories diverged like two rivers flowing away from a single source. These inconsistencies raised a troubling question for historians. If memory changes over time, then how much of history is accurate? But the deeper mystery was only beginning to emerge, because what ancient philosophers and historians had noticed through observation, modern science would eventually confirm with experiments. Human memory is not a recording device. It is something far more fragile and far more flexible. When we remember something, we are not retrieving a perfect file from storage. We are rebuilding the experience piece by piece. The sights, the sounds, the emotions. Each element is reconstructed by the brain in the present moment, and every reconstruction leaves room for subtle errors. Small details shift, timelines blur, New information sneaks in and attaches itself to old memories like vines climbing a wall. Over time, those vines become indistinguishable from the original structure. And this realization leads to a disturbing possibility. If memories can change slowly through time, could they also be changed deliberately? Ancient thinkers could only speculate. They lacked the tools to test their suspicions. But centuries later, scientists would begin performing experiments that pushed this question further than anyone in Plato's time could have imagined. Experiments that revealed something almost unbelievable. It might be possible to create memories that never happened at all. And once those memories take root inside the mind, they can feel just as real as the past itself. Which means the next mystery we must confront is even more unsettling. What happens when memory isn't just unreliable, but completely fabricated? Because in the late 19th century, a new generation of psychologists began discovering something that would change our understanding of the human mind forever. They found that memories could be planted, not metaphorically, but literally. And once the seed was placed inside the mind, it could grow into an entire past that never existed.
For most of human history, the strange instability of memory remained little more than a philosophical suspicion. Ancient thinkers sensed it, historians noticed it, storytellers quietly relied on it. But no one had truly tested it. Memory was still treated as something sacred, a private archive of the past locked inside the mind. Even when it changed, people assumed the change was accidental, like a faded photograph losing its color over time. That belief began to collapse in the late 19th century. Inside small laboratories in Europe, a new generation of researchers started asking a dangerous question. What if memory wasn't just unreliable? What if it could be deliberately manipulated? The first clues appeared in the work of the German psychologist Hermann Ebbinghaus, a man obsessed with understanding how memory actually worked. Unlike philosophers before him, Ebbinghaus decided to test memory through careful experimentation. He would sit alone in his study, staring at endless lists of meaningless syllables, strange combinations like Dax, Bach, or Zug. These syllables had no emotional meaning, no story attached to them, and no personal associations. They were designed to be pure memory. Ebbinghaus memorized thousands of these syllables, then tested himself hours, days, and weeks later to see how much he could recall. What he discovered shocked the scientific world. Memory fades rapidly, far faster than anyone expected. This pattern became known as the forgetting curve, showing that within hours of learning something new, a large portion of the information begins slipping away. But something else appeared in his results. When people tried to recall lost information, they didn't simply admit that it was gone. Their minds often filled in the gaps. They invented details that felt correct, and once those invented details settled into place, the brain treated them as genuine memories. It was the first experimental hint that memory might not just fade, it might quietly rewrite itself. As the 20th century began, another psychologist pushed this idea further. His name was Frederick Bartlett, and he conducted one of the most revealing memory experiments in history. Bartlett asked participants to read an unfamiliar Native American folktale called The War of the Ghosts. The story was strange to British readers. It contained supernatural elements, unfamiliar cultural references, and unusual narrative structures. After reading it once, participants were asked to retell the story days or weeks later. At first, the retellings were roughly accurate, but as time passed, something remarkable happened. The participants unconsciously reshaped the story. Details they found confusing were removed. Unfamiliar elements were replaced with more culturally familiar ones. Events were reorganized to fit the storytelling patterns their brains expected. By the time the story had been retold several times, it had transformed into something entirely different. Yet the participants were convinced they were recalling it correctly. Bartlett's experiment revealed something deeply unsettling. Memory does not function like a recording. It functions like a storyteller. Every time we remember something, our brain reconstructs the event using fragments, filling in missing pieces with assumptions, beliefs, and imagination.
Which means every act of remembering is also an act of editing. And once scientists realized this, they began to wonder something even more disturbing. If the brain naturally edits memories, could someone intentionally guide that process? For decades, the question remained mostly theoretical. Then, in the 1970s, a psychologist named Elizabeth Loftus began conducting experiments that would fundamentally challenge the legal system, the justice system, and our understanding of truth itself. Loftus was fascinated by eyewitness testimony. Courts around the world relied heavily on witnesses who claimed to remember crimes with perfect clarity. Their statements often determined whether someone was found guilty or innocent. But Loftus suspected something was wrong, so she designed a deceptively simple experiment. Participants watched short videos of car accidents. Afterward, they were asked questions about what they had seen. But some of the questions were phrased slightly differently. One group was asked, how fast were the cars going when they hit each other? Another group was asked, how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other? The difference seemed trivial, just a single word, but the results were extraordinary. Participants who heard the word smashed estimated much higher speeds and later reported seeing broken glass, even though no broken glass appeared in the video. This experiment became famous as the Loftus and Palmer experiment. It demonstrated that suggestion alone could reshape memory. A single word could subtly alter what people believed they had seen. And the more Loftus studied memory, the stranger the results became. Eventually, she conducted one of the most controversial psychological studies ever performed. Participants were told stories about their childhoods, most of them true events provided by family members. But hidden among the real stories was a fabricated one. The story described the participant getting lost in a shopping mall as a child, feeling scared, and eventually being rescued by an elderly stranger. At first, most participants insisted the event had never happened, but after repeated discussions and gentle encouragement, something astonishing occurred. Many participants began remembering the event vividly. They described what the mall looked like, what the stranger wore, how frightened they felt. Some even added new details that had never been suggested. This experiment became known as the Lost in the Mall experiment, and it proved something that had once seemed impossible. Entire memories could be implanted, not just small details, but full experiences. The mind would accept them, build emotions around them, and weave them seamlessly into a person's life story. By the late 20th century, psychologists were forced to confront an uncomfortable reality. Human memory is astonishingly powerful, but it is also astonishingly vulnerable. Every memory we carry has passed through countless moments of reconstruction. Each time we recall something, the memory briefly becomes flexible again, open to subtle changes before being stored once more. It's like rewriting a document over and over again. Eventually, the newest version may look very different from the original. And once this process became understood, another realization began to spread. If individuals can form false memories, then entire groups might also share memories that never truly happened. Nations, cultures, generations, all bound together by stories of the past. But what if those stories were quietly altered over time? What if millions of people could remember the same event, even if history recorded something entirely different? That possibility leads us to one of the most fascinating and disturbing puzzles in modern culture, a phenomenon where countless people around the world insist they remember the same things, yet reality seems to disagree. And the name given to this mystery sounds almost like something from science fiction, the Mandela Effect.
History often feels permanent. Printed in books, carved into monuments, repeated in classrooms, it gives the impression of something solid, a fixed record of what truly happened. But beneath that surface lies something far more fragile. History is not built directly from the past, it is built from memories of the past. Witnesses describe what they saw, survivors recount what they lived through, leaders write their own versions of events. Over time, these stories are recorded, repeated, and eventually accepted as truth. But what happens when those memories begin to change? What happens when entire populations begin remembering history differently? Sometimes the shift is slow, almost invisible. Other times, it happens so quickly that it feels as if the past itself has been rewritten overnight. One of the earliest thinkers to warn about this danger was the Greek historian Herodotus, often called the father of history. Herodotus traveled widely across the ancient world, collecting stories from soldiers, priests, and merchants about wars and civilizations that had come before. But he noticed something strange. The same event could be described in dramatically different ways depending on who told the story. One kingdom remembered a battle as a heroic victory. The opposing side remembered the exact same battle as a tragic betrayal. Both sides were certain their version was true. Herodotus understood something historians still struggle with today. Memory doesn't simply preserve history, it reshapes it. Centuries later, during the rise of powerful empires, rulers began to understand how useful this phenomenon could be. If memory could be shaped, then history itself could become a tool. One of the clearest examples comes from ancient Rome through a practice known as damnatio memoriae. When a Roman emperor or political figure fell from power, the Senate sometimes ordered their memory to be erased. Statues were destroyed, names were chiseled off monuments, portraits were altered or removed, official records were rewritten as if the person had never existed. To future generations, it would appear as though that individual had simply vanished from history. Yet the truth was far more unsettling. The past had been deliberately edited. This manipulation of collective memory became even more powerful as civilizations grew larger. Empires learned that controlling the story of the past meant controlling the beliefs of the present. Few periods demonstrate this more clearly than the 20th century, an era when technology allowed governments to reshape public memory on an unprecedented scale. In the Soviet Union, under the rule of Joseph Stalin, history itself became a political weapon. Photographs were altered to remove people who had fallen out of favor with the government. Political rivals disappeared not only from public life, but also from the visual record of the past. A famous example involves Leon Trotsky, once one of the most prominent figures of the Russian Revolution. After Trotsky became an enemy of Stalin, his image began quietly disappearing from historical photographs. Pictures that once showed him standing beside other revolutionary leaders were altered. His figure was erased. To later generations, it looked as if he had never been there. It was a chilling demonstration of how easily historical memory could be reshaped. If photographs, once believed to be objective records, could be altered, then the visual evidence of history itself became uncertain. And the more these edits were repeated through newspapers, textbooks, and official narratives, the more the altered version of history replaced the original in public consciousness. Eventually, entire generations grew up remembering events that had been subtly rewritten. But the manipulation of memory wasn't limited to authoritarian regimes. Even in democratic societies, collective memory often shifts in surprising ways. Wars, in particular, have a powerful influence on how nations remember the past. During times of conflict, governments and media outlets emphasize certain events while downplaying others. Heroic stories are repeated, failures are quietly forgotten. Over time, the simplified narrative becomes the dominant memory of the war. Yet historians digging through archives decades later often discover a far more complex reality. This phenomenon can be seen in many major conflicts of the 20th century, including World War I and World War II. Soldiers who fought in the trenches or on distant battlefields frequently described experiences that differed dramatically from the patriotic stories told back home. To them, the war was chaotic, terrifying, and morally ambiguous. But national memory gradually transformed those experiences into cleaner, more heroic narratives. This doesn't necessarily happen through deliberate deception. Sometimes it occurs naturally as societies attempt to make sense of painful events. Human beings prefer stories with clear meaning. We search for heroes, villains, and turning points.
But real history rarely fits those neat categories. And so, memory slowly reshapes the past until it becomes easier to understand. Yet, occasionally, something even stranger happens. Entire groups of people began remembering events in ways that directly contradict documented history. Not because of propaganda, not even because of censorship, but because their memories genuinely feel different from what records show. One example appeared in the early 21st century, when thousands of people began sharing an oddly specific recollection. They remembered learning that the South African leader Nelson Mandela had died in prison during the 1980s. Many could vividly recall news reports of his death. Some even remembered televised funerals and emotional speeches. Yet, when they checked historical records, they discovered something impossible. Nelson Mandela had not died in prison. He was released in 1990 and later became the president of South Africa. For those who remembered his earlier death, the realization was deeply unsettling. How could so many people share the same memory of an event that never happened? Was it simply confusion? Or was something stranger occurring inside the human mind? As similar cases began appearing across the internet, shared memories of movie lines, historical events, brand logos, and cultural details that seemed different from reality, people began giving the phenomenon a name. It would soon become one of the most widely discussed mysteries of modern memory, a strange intersection of psychology, culture, and perception. A moment when millions of people suddenly realized that their memories might not match the world around them. And the name chosen for this phenomenon carried a quiet historical irony, because it was inspired by that very same mystery involving Nelson Mandela, a mystery that would soon become known as the Mandela Effect. And once people began looking for it, they started finding it everywhere.
For most of history, strange memory errors remained private. A person might misremember a childhood event, confuse a detail from a book, or recall a conversation differently than a friend. These moments were usually dismissed with a shrug. Memory is imperfect, people would say. But in the early years of the internet, something unusual began happening. People from completely different countries, cultures, and generations started discovering that they shared the exact same incorrect memories. And the moment they compared those memories with reality, the feeling was deeply unsettling. One of the first people to notice this pattern was paranormal researcher Fiona Broome. In 2009, Broome attended a conference where a conversation drifted toward the life of Nelson Mandela. During the discussion, Broome casually mentioned remembering Mandela's death in prison during the 1980s. Another person nearby nodded, then another. Soon, several people were describing the same memory. They remembered television coverage, news reports, and public mourning after Mandela supposedly died in captivity. But there was a problem. Mandela had never died in prison. He had been released in 1990 and later became the president of South Africa.
The group checked historical records, news archives, and biographies. Every source confirmed the same thing. The memory they shared never happened. Yet it felt real. The experience fascinated Broom. She began researching whether others had similar shared false memories. What she discovered was astonishing. Thousands of people reported remembering the same events, phrases, or images differently from how they actually existed. Broom gave this strange phenomenon a name: the Mandela Effect. And once people started looking for it, they found example after example. One of the most famous involves a beloved children's book series called The Berenstain Bears. Many readers vividly remember the title spelled as the Berenstein Bears, with an E. They remember seeing the books on library shelves, hearing teachers pronounce the name that way, and even owning copies themselves. But when they check the covers today, the spelling is different. The books have always been titled The Berenstain Bears, with an A. For people who remember the other spelling, the discovery feels strangely disorienting. It's not a vague memory. It's a clear, confident one. And yet it appears to be wrong. Another famous example involves a line from the iconic science fiction film Star Wars Episode V, The Empire Strikes Back. For decades, millions of fans have quoted a dramatic moment in which the villain, Darth Vader, reveals a shocking truth to his enemy, Luke Skywalker. Most people remember the line as, "Luke, I am your father." It has appeared that way in jokes, advertisements, and pop culture references for years. But when people re-watch the film, they hear something slightly different. The actual line is, "No, I am your father." The word Luke is never spoken in that moment. Yet the misquoted version feels more familiar to many people than the original. These strange discrepancies began appearing everywhere. Some people remembered the board game mascot Rich Uncle Pennybags wearing a monocle, but the character in Monopoly has never worn one. Others were convinced that the cartoon character Pikachu had a black stripe at the end of his tail. In reality, the tail has always been solid yellow. Individually, these examples might seem trivial, the kind of small errors anyone could make. But what made the Mandela Effect fascinating was how many people shared the same incorrect memories. Sometimes thousands, sometimes millions, across continents, across languages, across generations. People who had never met each other described the same altered versions of reality. And when they compared notes online, the reaction was often the same: a strange mixture of curiosity and unease. Because memory is deeply connected to identity. When you discover that a memory you trusted is wrong, it doesn't just challenge a small detail. It challenges your confidence in your own mind. Psychologists studying the Mandela Effect often point to the brain's natural tendency to simplify and organize information. For example, the phrase, "Luke, I am your father," fits more naturally into conversation than the original line. Our brains unconsciously reshape memories into forms that feel easier to understand or repeat. But sometimes the Mandela Effect seems to go beyond simple convenience. Consider another famous example from the film Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Many people remember the evil queen speaking to her magical mirror with the line, "Mirror, mirror on the wall." Yet in the original movie, the line is slightly different. She actually says, "Magic mirror on the wall." For countless viewers who grew up quoting the phrase, "Mirror, mirror," the difference feels almost impossible. How could such a widely repeated line be remembered incorrectly by so many people? Some explanations point to the power of repetition in culture. Once a simplified version of a phrase appears in parodies, advertisements, or everyday conversation, it gradually replaces the original in people's memories. Over time, the cultural echo becomes louder than the source. But not everyone finds that explanation satisfying. In online forums and discussions, some people propose more exotic theories. They suggest the Mandela Effect might be evidence of parallel universes intersecting with our own,
or timelines shifting slightly, or reality itself changing in subtle ways. Scientists generally view these ideas as speculative, yet the popularity of those theories reveals something important. The Mandela Effect taps into a deep human fear, the fear that the world might not be as stable as it appears. Because if our memories, the very things we rely on to understand the past, can be so easily reshaped, then what else might we be remembering incorrectly? And this question becomes even more unsettling when we consider something modern neuroscience has begun to demonstrate. Shared false memories like the Mandela Effect might not simply be cultural accidents. They might reflect a deeper truth about how the brain constructs reality itself. A truth scientists began uncovering inside research laboratories, where experiments with animals and human brains started revealing something extraordinary. Memories are not just fragile. They are biological structures, patterns of neurons and chemical signals that can be modified, strengthened, or even rewritten. And once researchers realized that, they began asking a question that would have sounded like science fiction only decades earlier. What if memories could be created on purpose? Not just influenced by suggestion, but physically implanted inside the brain. The answer to that question would emerge from a series of groundbreaking experiments that pushed the science of memory into completely new territory. Experiments that proved something both fascinating and deeply unsettling. It is possible to give a living creature a memory of something that never happened.
For centuries, the strange flexibility of memory was only a suspicion. Philosophers debated it, historians observed it, psychologists tested its weaknesses. But by the early 21st century, scientists began doing something far more radical. They stopped simply studying memories. They started engineering them. Inside quiet neuroscience laboratories filled with humming machines and glowing monitors, researchers began investigating a simple but profound question. Where exactly does a memory live inside the brain? At first glance, the human brain looks like an impossibly tangled forest of neurons, roughly 86 billion cells constantly sending electrical signals to one another. But hidden within that complexity are tiny patterns of activity, networks of neurons that activate together when we remember something. These networks are often called engrams, the physical traces of memory stored in neural circuits. The idea of memory engrams had existed for decades, but proving their existence was extraordinarily difficult. That began to change with the work of neuroscientist Susumu Tonegawa working at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Tonegawa and his team were studying how memories form in the brains of mice. Mice may seem like simple creatures, but their brains share many structural similarities with human brains, especially in a small region called the hippocampus. This region plays a crucial role in forming and retrieving memories of experiences and environments. Tonegawa's team wanted to identify the exact group of neurons responsible for storing a particular memory. So they designed an experiment that sounded almost like science fiction. First, they placed a mouse in a new environment, a small chamber with unique smells and textures. As the mouse explored the space, a specific group of neurons in its hippocampus became active, encoding the memory of that environment. Using advanced genetic techniques, the scientists tagged those neurons so they could be controlled later with pulses of light. This method is known as optogenetics. Then came the crucial moment. The mouse was moved into a completely different chamber, a place it had never experienced before. While the mouse was exploring this new environment, the scientists used light to reactivate the neurons associated with the first chamber. At the exact same moment, the mouse received a mild electric shock. The result was extraordinary. The mouse's brain connected the shock to the memory of the first room, not the one it was currently standing in. Later, when the mouse was returned to the original chamber, where the shock had never occurred, it froze in fear. Its brain believed that environment was dangerous. The mouse had formed a false memory. The experiment demonstrated something revolutionary. Memories could be activated, altered, and reassigned by manipulating specific neural circuits. But the scientists pushed the idea even further. In a later experiment, they successfully created a memory of a frightening experience that had never happened at all. The mouse behaved as though it remembered an event that existed only as a pattern of stimulated neurons. To the brain, the difference between real and artificial memory had disappeared. Around the same time, another group of researchers at University of California, Irvine conducted a different but equally startling experiment. Led by neuroscientist Steve Ramirez, the team explored whether emotional memories could be modified. They worked with mice that had learned to associate a particular environment with fear. Ordinarily, such memories are extremely persistent. Fear memories help animals survive by teaching them which places or situations are dangerous. But Ramirez and his colleagues discovered something remarkable. By stimulating specific neurons linked to positive experiences, they could rewrite the emotional tone of the fear memory. The same environment that once triggered panic now produced calm behavior. The memory itself had not been erased, but its emotional meaning had been transformed. In other words, the past had been rewritten inside the brain. These discoveries revealed something astonishing about memory. Memories are not static recordings stored permanently in the mind. They are living biological structures, flexible networks that can change every time they are recalled. Each time we remember something, the brain briefly opens the memory for editing before storing it again. This process is known as memory reconsolidation. During reconsolidation, memories become temporarily fragile. New information can slip into them, emotions can alter them, even entirely new details can attach themselves to the original experience. It's like reopening a saved document on a computer. Once the file is open, changes can be made before it's saved again.
Most of the time, these edits are small and harmless. A slightly different facial expression, a misplaced word in a conversation, a changed order of events. But under the right conditions, the edits can become much larger. Entire memories can shift in meaning. And if scientists can manipulate this process in animals, it raises a question that feels both thrilling and terrifying. Could the same thing be done in humans? The implications are enormous. Imagine being able to remove the painful emotional charge from traumatic memories. Victims of war or violence could remember their experiences without reliving the fear. People suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder might finally find relief. In fact, researchers are already exploring therapies that use reconsolidation to treat trauma, addiction, and phobias. But every powerful technology carries two sides. If memories can be healed, they might also be manipulated. The same techniques that could reduce suffering might one day allow memories to be altered deliberately. Experiences could be softened, intensified, or even replaced. And once you begin imagining that possibility, an unsettling question naturally follows. If memory shapes identity, if our sense of self is built from the experiences we remember, then altering memory might also alter who we are. It would mean the past is not a fixed foundation. It's more like wet clay, capable of being reshaped long after the original moment has passed. And as scientists continue unlocking the biological secrets of memory, the power to reshape that clay is becoming more real. Which brings us to another disturbing possibility. Because long before modern neuroscience discovered how flexible memory truly is, governments, intelligence agencies, and powerful institutions were already attempting to influence and control it, not with lasers or genetic tools, but with something far older: psychology, propaganda, and carefully crafted narratives designed to shape what entire populations remember. The history of memory manipulation, it turns out, may be far more political than scientific.
and some of its most fascinating chapters were written in the shadows of the Cold War. Long before scientists learned how to manipulate memory with light and neurons, powerful institutions had already discovered something important. You didn't need advanced technology to reshape memory. All you needed was control over information. Control what people hear. Control what they see. Control which stories are repeated. And slowly, almost invisibly, memory begins to change. Because memory does not live in isolation inside individual minds. It lives in conversations, newspapers, classrooms, films, and public rituals. Change the story often enough, and eventually the story becomes the memory. This realization became especially powerful during the 20th century, an era when mass communication suddenly gave governments the ability to influence millions of minds at once. Radio broadcasts could reach entire nations overnight. Newspapers could frame events before people had time to process them. Films and posters could shape emotions long before facts were fully understood. And in the middle of global conflict, controlling memory became almost as important as controlling territory. One of the most sophisticated practitioners of this strategy was Joseph Goebbels, the chief propagandist of Adolf Hitler. Goebbels understood something deeply psychological about human beings. People rarely question information that confirms what they already want to believe. So instead of inventing entirely new realities, propaganda often works by amplifying certain memories while suppressing others. Victories are celebrated endlessly. Defeats are minimized or blamed on outsiders. Symbols and slogans are repeated until they become emotionally embedded in the national identity. Over time, these narratives begin to shape how citizens remember the past. Events become simplified into stories of heroes and enemies. Complex historical realities fade into the background, and slowly the public memory of history begins drifting away from what actually happened. This wasn't unique to one country. During World War II, nearly every major nation used propaganda to influence how its population understood the war. Governments produced films, posters, and radio broadcasts designed not just to inform people, but to guide their interpretation of events. Stories of bravery were elevated. Stories of confusion or failure were quietly ignored. By the time the war ended, millions of people across different countries remembered the conflict through narratives carefully shaped by their own governments. Yet propaganda was only one layer of memory manipulation. In the 10th decades that followed, the struggle between global superpowers introduced a new dimension: psychological experimentation. During the early years of the Cold War, intelligence agencies became increasingly fascinated by the possibility of controlling human thought. If memories could be altered or influenced, it might be possible to create more effective interrogations, or even reshape a person's beliefs entirely. In the United States, the Central Intelligence Agency launched a controversial research initiative known as MK-Ultra. Beginning in the 1950s, MK-Ultra funded dozens of secret experiments exploring the limits of psychological influence. Researchers studied hypnosis, sensory deprivation, drugs, and extreme interrogation techniques. Some experiments investigated whether substances like LSD could alter perception and memory in ways that might make individuals more susceptible to suggestion. Many of these studies were conducted without the full consent of participants, a fact that would later spark intense public outrage when the program became known. Although MK-Ultra never achieved the dramatic mind control depicted in spy novels, it revealed something important. Human memory and perception could be significantly influenced under the right conditions, and intelligence agencies around the world were willing to explore those limits. Meanwhile, psychologists studying interrogation methods noticed something equally disturbing. When individuals are subjected to extreme stress, exhaustion, or isolation, their memories can become remarkably malleable. In certain circumstances, people may begin doubting their own recollections. Under repeated suggestion, they may even adopt new narratives about events they previously experienced differently. This phenomenon became controversial in legal systems as well. Throughout the 20th century, courts often relied heavily on eyewitness testimony. A confident witness describing what they saw could strongly influence a jury. But psychologists increasingly warned that eyewitness memory is far less reliable than it appears. Experiments by researchers like Elizabeth Loftus demonstrated that simple changes in wording could alter what witnesses believed they had seen. Even subtle suggestions from investigators could unintentionally reshape a witness's recollection of events. In some cases, this led to devastating consequences. People were convicted of crimes based on eyewitness memories that later turned out to be mistaken. Years later, DNA evidence would prove that some of those convictions were wrong.
The problem wasn't dishonesty. The witnesses truly believed their memories were accurate, but memory had quietly reshaped the past. As these discoveries accumulated, a troubling realization began spreading among historians, psychologists, and legal scholars. Memory is not just vulnerable to internal errors. It can be influenced from the outside, through suggestion, through narrative, through repetition. And when that influence is applied across an entire population, through education, media, and culture, it can gradually reshape collective memory. Over generations, entire societies may begin remembering historical events in simplified or altered ways. The original complexities fade. The emotional narrative remains. Yet the story of memory manipulation does not end with propaganda or psychological pressure. In fact, compared to what modern neuroscience is beginning to explore, those methods might seem almost primitive. Because today, researchers are moving closer to something far more direct, not just influencing memory through stories or suggestion, but physically interacting with the brain itself. New technologies are emerging that may allow scientists to enhance, erase, or rewrite memories with increasing precision. And if those technologies continue advancing, the future could bring possibilities that once existed only in science fiction. A world where traumatic memories might be removed, where experiences could be edited, where entirely new memories might be implanted with astonishing realism. It sounds incredible, but the foundations for that future are already being built. And if humanity ever gains full control over memory itself, the question will no longer be whether memory can be manipulated. The question will be who decides which memories remain and which ones disappear. For most of human history, the past has been something we carry with us. Memories accumulate quietly over time. Moments of joy, fear, love, regret, layering themselves into the story we call a life. We cannot erase them. We cannot rewind them. At best, we learn to live with them. But for the first time in history, that limitation may not last forever. Across neuroscience laboratories, hospitals, and research institutes, scientists are beginning to explore something extraordinary: the possibility of engineering memory itself. Not simply studying how memories work, but actively altering them. And first, these efforts were motivated by compassion rather than curiosity. Researchers were searching for ways to help people trapped inside painful memories. Individuals suffering from conditions like post-traumatic stress disorder, where traumatic experiences replay endlessly in the mind. For soldiers returning from war, survivors of violence, and victims of catastrophic accidents, memories can become relentless. A single sound, smell, or image can trigger vivid recollections that feel as real as the original moment. The brain reacts as though the danger is happening again. Heart rate rises, muscles tense, fear floods the body. It is not simply remembering the past, it is reliving it. Scientists searching for treatments began focusing on a remarkable property of memory discovered in modern neuroscience, a process called memory reconsolidation. When a memory is recalled, it does not remain frozen. For a brief window of time, the memory becomes unstable, almost like a file opened for editing. During this moment, the brain has an opportunity to modify the memory before storing it again. Researchers realized that if they could influence this reconsolidation process, they might be able to soften the emotional impact of traumatic memories. One promising line of research involved medications such as propranolol. Originally developed to treat heart conditions, propranolol also affects how the brain processes emotional intensity. In certain clinical studies, patients were asked to recall traumatic experiences while under the influence of the medication. The memory itself remained intact, but its emotional charge gradually weakened. Over time, recalling the event no longer triggered the overwhelming fear that once accompanied it. The past had not been erased, but it had been emotionally rewritten. Meanwhile, researchers were exploring even more advanced technologies. One of the most ambitious efforts involves devices that interact directly with the brain's electrical activity. A striking example comes from experiments using deep brain stimulation, a technique already used to treat conditions like Parkinson's disease. In this procedure, tiny electrodes are implanted in specific regions of the brain. These electrodes deliver controlled electrical pulses that influence neural activity. While the primary goal has been treating movement disorders, some neuroscientists have begun investigating whether similar stimulation could influence memory formation and recall. Early experiments have produced intriguing results. In certain cases, stimulating particular brain regions has improved a patient's ability to retrieve forgotten information. In others, electrical signals appear to enhance memory consolidation, helping the brain store experiences more effectively. The idea that technology could one day strengthen memory itself no longer seems impossible. But if memories can be strengthened, could they also be replaced? This possibility is being explored through a growing field known as neuroengineering. Researchers in this field are developing sophisticated interfaces capable of reading and influencing neuroactivity. Some experiments have already demonstrated that patterns of brain signals associated with learning can be transferred between individuals, at least in simplified forms. In one fascinating study, scientists trained animals to perform a particular task while recording the neural patterns involved. Those patterns were then stimulated in another animal's brain, allowing it to perform the task more quickly than it otherwise would have learned. It wasn't quite the transfer of a full memory, but it hinted at something extraordinary: the possibility that knowledge itself might someday be transferable. If such technology advances far enough, the implications could reshape human experience. Imagine learning a new language by downloading the neural patterns associated with it. Imagine acquiring complex skills, musical performance, engineering techniques, medical procedures, through direct neural stimulation. Education might transform completely. But alongside these astonishing possibilities come difficult ethical questions. If memories and skills can be added, could they also be removed?
Would people choose to erase painful experiences from their lives? Would governments or institutions attempt to control which memories individuals are allowed to keep? And perhaps most importantly, how much of our identity depends on the memories we carry? The philosopher John Locke once proposed that personal identity is deeply connected to memory. According to Locke, who we are is shaped by the continuity of our experiences, the chain of memories linking our present self to our past. Break that chain, and identity itself begins to blur. If future technologies allow memories to be edited, replaced, or erased, the boundary between past and present may become far less stable. A person could alter the emotional meaning of their childhood. They could remove painful chapters from their life story. They might even insert experiences they never lived through. Over time, the story of a person's life could become something closer to a curated narrative than a natural history. The possibilities are both hopeful and unsettling. Memory engineering could help millions of people heal from trauma. It could enhance learning, creativity, and resilience. But it could also open doors to manipulation on a scale humanity has never faced before. Because if memories define our understanding of reality, then controlling memory might mean controlling how people perceive truth itself. And this leads us to the final question, one that philosophers, scientists, and historians have been circling for centuries. If memory can change, if it can be reshaped by time, suggestion, technology, or culture, then what exactly anchors our sense of self? What makes your memories truly yours? The answer may lie not only in science or psychology, but in a deeper reflection about identity, experience, and the fragile thread connecting the present to the past. And in the final part of our journey, we confront the most unsettling possibility of all. What if the memories guiding your life were never entirely yours to begin with?
Late at night, when the world grows quiet and the mind drifts backward through the corridors of the past, memory becomes something almost magical. A single smell can reopen an entire year of your life. A song can bring back a forgotten face. A photograph can unlock moments you thought had vanished forever. These memories feel solid, personal, unquestionably yours. They are the invisible threads connecting your present self to every version of you that existed before. But by now, after everything we've explored, from ancient philosophy to modern neuroscience, that certainty begins to feel slightly less stable. Because memory is not a vault, it is a living process. Every recollection is reconstructed inside the mind, piece by piece, shaped by emotions, expectations, and the information surrounding us. The more we remember something, the more we reshape it. And over the course of a lifetime, those tiny adjustments accumulate until the past becomes something subtly different from what it once was. This realization fascinated philosophers long before laboratories confirmed it. One of the thinkers who wrestled deeply with the relationship between memory and identity was the English philosopher John Locke. Locke proposed a simple yet profound idea. A person's identity is tied not to their body, but to their continuity of memory. In other words, you are the same person today as you were years ago because you remember being that person. Your memories form a chain linking every moment of your life together. Break that chain, and something strange begins to happen. We see glimpses of this phenomenon in certain neurological conditions. Patients suffering from amnesia may lose access to entire sections of their past. They wake up knowing their name, but unable to recall their childhood. They recognize familiar faces without remembering the experiences they shared. To outsiders, they appear physically unchanged, but internally, the continuity of their identity has been disrupted. Part of their story has vanished, and without those memories, the meaning of their present life shifts in unexpected ways. Yet, memory loss is only one side of the mystery, because modern psychology has revealed something even more intriguing. Sometimes, memories appear that were never part of the original story at all. Through suggestion, imagination, or emotional influence, people can develop vivid recollections of events that never occurred. Experiments by psychologists such as Elizabeth Loftus have shown that these false memories can feel just as real as genuine ones. The brain does not easily distinguish between a memory built from experience and one constructed from suggestion. Both become part of the narrative we carry about our lives. And once a memory is woven into that narrative, it begins shaping how we see ourselves. Think about the stories you tell about your own life.
Perhaps you remember a moment when a teacher encouraged you, convincing you that you were capable of something greater. Maybe you recall a failure that taught you resilience, or a childhood experience that sparked a lifelong passion. These memories influence the decisions you make. They guide your ambitions, fears, and relationships. But if memory is flexible, if it can change over time, then the story you tell about your life may also be evolving. The past itself does not change, but the meaning of the past does. Historians often observe a similar phenomenon when studying societies. Entire nations build identities around collective memories, victories in war, struggles for independence, cultural achievements. These memories become symbols, repeated through education and tradition. Yet historians frequently discover that the details of those events were far more complex than the stories that survived. Over time, societies reshape their memories in ways that support their current identity. Individuals do something remarkably similar. We edit our past, consciously or unconsciously, to create a narrative that helps us understand who we are. Moments that support our self-image become clearer. Moments that challenge it may fade into the background. In this sense, memory behaves less like a recording device and more like a storyteller, and storytellers always choose which details to emphasize. Yet even if memories shift, evolve, or occasionally mislead us, they still serve an essential purpose. They create continuity. They give shape to the otherwise chaotic flow of time. Without memory, life would dissolve into isolated moments with no connection between them. The philosopher David Hume once suggested that the self might not be a fixed entity at all. Instead, he proposed that the mind is more like a bundle of perceptions, a constantly changing collection of experiences and memories. If that idea is true, then identity is not something static, it is something continuously constructed. Every day, every experience, every remembered moment contributes to the version of yourself that exists right now. And perhaps that realization softens the unsettling nature of memory's imperfections. Because if memory were perfectly accurate, a flawless recording of every moment, life might feel strangely rigid. There would be no room for reinterpretation, no space for growth or forgiveness, no ability to look back at painful experiences and gradually reshape their meaning. Memory's flexibility, in many ways, is what allows us to move forward. Yet the questions raised by modern neuroscience still linger. If technology eventually gives us the power to edit memories deliberately, humanity will face choices unlike any in history. Should painful memories be erased? Should traumatic experiences be softened? Should people be allowed to insert entirely new memories into their lives? Each possibility carries consequences for how we understand identity, responsibility, and truth. Because once memory becomes editable, the line between experience and invention begins to blur, and the story of a human life could become something closer to a designed narrative. But perhaps the most important question remains surprisingly simple. Even if memories are imperfect, even if they change over time, even if some details are mistaken, does that make them any less meaningful? After all, what truly defines a memory may not be its perfect accuracy. It may be the emotions it carries, the lessons it leaves behind, the way it shapes the choices we make in the present. Your memories, whether flawless or flawed, are still the map that guided you to this moment. They are the reason you believe what you believe, the reason you care about the things you care about. And in that sense, they are still deeply, unmistakably yours. But as you close this chapter of the story and step back into the quiet of your own thoughts, one final question remains.
the same question that has echoed through philosophy, psychology, and history for centuries. If your memories are constantly changing, if some of them may have been reshaped by suggestion, culture, or imagination, then the next time you recall a moment from your past, you might pause for a second and wonder, are you remembering the event or remembering the story your mind created about it?